Hello everyone. In this interactive video map, we analyze how cultural differences and the invisible curriculum operate within a bilingual learning environment. Our analysis focuses on a private bilingual school in Bogota where English plays a central role in the educational model. In many Colombian private schools, bilingual education is associated with global competitiveness, academic excellence, and access to international opportunities. However, several scholars have pointed out that bilingualism in Colombia is frequently reduced to the Spanish English relationship, overlooking the multilingual reality of the country and positioning English as a language of prestige within educational institutions. As modern colleagues argue, language policies in Colombia have often linked English learning with economic development and global competitiveness, reinforcing its symbolic value within education. From this perspective, English is not only a tool for communication but also a symbol of academic capital and social status. In this video map, we explore how this context shapes pedagogical practices, sociocultural expectations, linguistic heritage, and students' identities, while also revealing elements of the invisible curriculum that influence participation and recognition in the classroom. Pedagogical problem. Within this educational context, we identify a central pedagogical problem: the perception that speaking English fluently represents greater intelligence, competence, and academic ability. In many bilingual classrooms, students who demonstrate higher proficiency in English tend to receive more recognition and participation opportunities, while those with lower proficiency may feel excluded or less capable. This dynamic reflects what scholars describe as linguistic hierarchies, where certain languages and certain ways of speaking them are valued more than others. Consequently, the classroom becomes a space where language proficiency can influence power relations, participation patterns, and student sense of belonging. This phenomenon is closely related to the concept of the invisible curriculum, which refers to the implicit norms, values, and expectations that shape learning beyond the official curriculum. The dimensions to be considered are educational dimension, sociocultural dimension, human and identity dimension, political dimension, and linguistic dimension. Educational dimension. From the educational perspective, classroom practices often reinforce this linguistic hierarchies. For example, bilingual programs frequently emphasize English only policies, where the use of Spanish may be discouraged during academic activities. While these policies aim to strengthen language immersion, they can also limit students' opportunities to use their full linguistic repertoire for learning. Research on culturally relevant pedagogy highlights the importance of validating students' linguistic and cultural identities within educational environments. When teaching practices do not acknowledge these identities, students who struggle with English may feel marginalized or reluctant to participate, which ultimately affects their learning experience. Therefore, the educational dimension reveals how pedagogical decisions can intentionally reinforce unequal participation in bilingual classrooms.
Now, taking into account the sociocultural dimension, it is possible to say that the value attributed to English in bilingual schools is closely connected to broader social beliefs. In many middle and upper schools or contexts in Colombia, English is associated with professional success, international mobility, and higher social status. As a result, families often view bilingual education as a pathway to economic and cultural capital. This perception shapes expectations within the school community and influences how students perceive the importance of English in their academic development. However, when English becomes a symbol of prestige, it can also reinforce social inequalities, especially between students who have greater exposure to the language outside school and those who do not. Therefore, the sociocultural dimension helps explain why linguistic hierarchies emerge and persist within bilingual educational environments. Now, regarding the human and identity dimension, it is possible to say language learning is deeply connected to students' identities. In bilingual classrooms, students constantly negotiate how they position themselves in relation to the language they use. When English proficiency becomes a marker of competence or intelligence, students may develop feelings of linguistic insecurity if they perceive they are not good enough. Intercultural education emphasizes the importance of recognizing and valuing the diverse identities, the experiences, and the knowledge that students bring to the classroom. By acknowledging these identities, educators can create learning environments that promote inclusion and respect rather than reinforcing this battle between languages or cultures. Thus, the human dimension highlights how linguistic practices influence students' self perception, confidence, and sense of belonging in bilingual settings.
So now we can talk about political dimension. Um, Political and institutional factors have influenced the different dynamics observed in bilingual classrooms. The different policies in terms of education have promoted English as a strategy language to the economic development and global integration. Therefore, programs such as National Bilingual has established policies, strategies, and dynamics in schools to prioritize and strengthen English proficiency. However, these ideas and initiatives could generate a linguistic hierarchy over the rest of languages spoken in the country. Consequently, bilingual education has become part of a political project which generates a prioritized vision in terms of economic and global relations powers. Define linguistic dimension. In this case, it is possible to dip into the plurilingualism concept, which allows people can draw and use resources to communicate and speak. That is why plurilingualism allows the interaction between languages and, at the same time, allows the usage of a broader repertoire. In a classroom, it is possible to notice practices such as translanguaging, which uses elements of both languages, mother tongue and target language, to construct meaning and support understanding. Nevertheless, school policies like the use of a target language all the time result in perceiving both languages as systems complete and strictly separated. Consequently, it is possible to talk about invisible curriculum. The interaction of the dimensions generates the presence of an invisible curriculum in bilingual education. Despite the curriculum in the schools focuses on languages learning objectives, constantly some implicit messages are sent through classroom practices and institutional rules. It is possible to perceive this, for instance, when students who have greater fluency may receive more attention and recognition from the teachers and institution in general. Moreover, some absence expressions or pronunciation could be perceived as more legitimate, appropriate, or better than others. As a result, these kind of experiences might influence how students can live, learn, and experience bilingual education.
Other important aspect to take into account is culture versus nationality. Nationality refers to belonging to a particular country, whereas culture encompasses the practices, values, beliefs, and forms of interaction that shape people's experiences. Within the same classroom, students may share the same nationality, but they possess very different cultural and linguistic identities. Recognizing this distinction is essential for this understanding of diversity that exists within bilingual educational environments.
Before finishing, it's relevant to talk about the colonial and intercultural perspective. In order to perceive a decolonial perspective, at first it is pretty important to wonder whether English really represents progress, modernity, and intellectual superiority. In this way, concepts like the colonial pedagogy invite us to critically examine how historical and power relations permeate language and bilingual education. At the same time, concepts like intercultural education allow the connection between cultures and languages in scenarios where value linguistic divergences and cultural diversity. In this way, it is possible to recognize the bilingual education not only of the idea of teaching English, but also as the opportunity to develop critical awareness about culture, language, and power.
In conclusion, our interactive video map demonstrates that bilingual education is shaped by multiple interconnected dimensions, including educational practices, sociocultural expectations, political frameworks, linguistic ideologies, and students' identities. Within a private bilingual school in Bogota, English can function not only as a language of instruction but also as a symbol of prestige and academic capital. By examining these dynamics, we reveal how the invisible curriculum operates through language hierarchies, participation patterns, and cultural assumptions. Developing critical cultural awareness allows educators and students to recognize these structures and work toward more inclusive and equitable bilingual learning environments.